Hello, my dear friends. Today we're going to talk about markets in human design, but specifically internal markets in human design. If you are in internal markets in human design, obviously keep listening. If you're in external markets in human design, I think you should keep listening as well, because I've actually learned a lot about these elements of my human design chart by reading or trying to understand other people's or like the opposites of what mine is. So I hope you guys find this helpful. So let's start out with like markets specifically. And this is where I've been trying to record this video a few times now, but every time I'm like, I don't think I said it quite right. How we use our words really matters, for one, because it changes the translation or the interpretation of the thing that we're trying to explain. Secondly, just because something is regurgitated multiple times doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. So in this particular example, like if you search markets human design on Google, then a lot of things are gonna but all the blog posts have the similarities in common, that they're all basically explaining the same thing. And while there are elements of it that are true, I'm not gonna say that I don't agree with what they're saying. I just think that there's just these generalizations, maybe, I don't know if that's the right word, or I think it just has led to a misinterpretation of the true essence of what the thing actually is. And I also think too that the way that the arrow faces in anything in your chart, so those 4 arrows, actually really makes a difference in terms of your experience of that color or tone in your human design. So like with markets, for example, if your bottom left arrow faces left, then you're internal. If your bottom left arrow faces right, then you're external. And the experience of an external markets to me is one that is almost like unrelatable to me personally. And then that's where I also have kind of run into some issues when I'm reading about markets and human design, that I think oftentimes a lot of it is related to external markets, because that one we can conceptualize more in a sense, perhaps maybe make a bit more of an understanding about it, because markets is considered a hardscape in human design. So hardscapes would be more like literal, like physical things, as opposed to like metaphorical or theoretical. Yeah, metaphorical is the word I want to use there. So, however, I would argue that internal markets is metaphorical. It's not a hardscape, in my opinion, just from my experience. And this is the one thing where it's just because something is explained to you a certain way, that like this is what's true for this aspect of your human design chart, doesn't necessarily mean that it's true for you. I think you just need to take some time to kind of read into it and be like, because oftentimes this is where the issue has come in for me, is that I've been explained things in my chart, and then it's almost made me feel like there's something wrong with me, or that I don't understand myself very well, because I can't relate to the thing that's been explained to me about this who I am in this human design element. And also too, the way that I kind of started to think about this a little bit more was, if you read into astrology stuff, because astrology to me has been interpreted there's been more thought put into it, in terms of the interpretations of what things mean, I think, because you're going to find a whole bunch of different pieces of information that don't specifically overlap like you would in human design. And even the other day, as an example, I have a transit reading and I read it, periodically, because I find it interesting. But one of the things in the transit chart that I was reading about something that's happening planetary wise in my whatever, was really I don't know, negative, pessimistic, stressful. But when I was kind of exploring a little bit more, okay, well, what does this transit mean? And, kind of reading more into it, the information I was finding about it was not what I had read. It was a completely different interpretation. and one that I resonated with more, one that made more sense to me than the other one. And so, yeah, this is where in human design, I don't really believe that interpretation piece has been explored as much as it has in other forms of, spirituality, like astrology, for example. So internal markets, human design. Let's get back to that. So first off, let's start off with markets in general. Markets is a second color. So the second color is all about I wrote some of this stuff down too, by the way, because I wanted to make sure I kind of say this more correctly as I can. The second color is like appreciation of variety, selectivity, perhaps a gatherer, just refinement, taste, the development of taste. Again, I think that comes along with the word refinement. There can be security and repetition and familiarity, but again, that comes with the sides, with the arrow sides, the way the arrow is facing, preference, things like, refinement to me is kind of like that whole encompassing thing. So we'll keep it at that. So let's just keep the essence of the word refinement, because everything else that I'm thinking in my head is but that kind of comes into refinement. So second color is refinement, selection, refinement type of vibe. That would be markets. Markets, we're also commonly taught, is because it's a hardscape, is areas of exchange. So, a lot of business related things, like a literal market. Probably someone who has a markets in human design probably enjoys more being in a city center, because there's so much selectivity. That whole vibe is markets, exchanges of information, exchanges of goods, those types of things. That's all great and everything, and I do understand where some of that stuff is coming from, but this is where the way the arrow faces changes things. So I'm internal markets and human design, as I had mentioned, so I'm going to kind of explain what I've kind of learned from that and then translate it to what I believe to be true for me. So internal markets would be people who are more comfortable in stable environments, something that has some structure and consistency. So for example, my home, my space that I spend the most time in is my sanctuary, and I am constantly trying to refine it, constantly trying to perfect it, just make it just right, the temperature in here, the smell, the scents that I use in here, the fabrics that I choose to put around blankets or my bedding or anything like that. Orientations in space. So I really like bright spaces. I don't really like spaces that are darker. So it's very refined sensitivity. And it, even to the point where where my nightstand is in orientation to the bed and the wall, it matters to me. Little things like that, refinement, constantly trying to create the perfect space. And maybe an external markets person can understand that as well. But for me, it was that made sense to me, because internal markets, it's more like the feeling or the vibe that something is giving me, as opposed to the literal scape necessarily. So it's my feeling of my orientation in space, and especially in a space that's my comfort zone. So that would be my apartment, for example. The structure and consistency, things that actually bring me joy in the morning, is I have my morning routine. I don't always like having specific routines, but there are things that are really important to me that I have routines around, because those things bring me joy. One of those things is coffee. I need, it needs to be perfect. If it's not perfect, it's everything gets thrown off. That's to me, that refinement, kind of specificity thing where you can see that bit of consistency kind of going on, where like there is some type of structure going on there, and that repetition. So one thing too that kind of confused me about the markets bit that I couldn't really relate to was I really like going to the same spaces over and over and over again, because it's like I'm refining or perfecting the experience of the technique, or like, I don't know, it brings me joy to do that. So like, I like to travel, but I like to travel frequently to the same places over and over and over again. So like, I want to frequently like get on a plane and go to the airport, but where I'm flying to, I want it to be frequent. I want it to be the same spot. I don't necessarily need or want to go to new places all the time. I like familiarity. That's something that's really important to me. But I still like I still like having experiences and adventure and whatever, but it needs to be experiences and adventure based on a repetition of something. And that's more internal markets. So like, I've selected what's good. I've like gotten the vibe of the things that I like, and I'm going to repeat those things over and over and over again until I get to a point where it doesn't feel what's good anymore, where it's not like as fresh, and then I'm going to probably switch it up to something else. So an example too is when I find like a space that I really like a coffee shop, for example, I will go to the same coffee shop over and over and over and over again. I don't want to go to another coffee shop. I don't care to go to another coffee shop, because you know how much work it's taken me to find a spot that I actually like love the vibe of, the space orientation, that type of stuff. Even like going out for dinner is another thing too. And what I order off the menu, it's not going to be new all the time. It's going to be the one thing that I found off the menu that I really liked, and I'm going to order that thing every single time I go to that restaurant, likely, unless, you know, I'm switching things up because it's like not the vibe anymore to specifically have that thing. But for the most part, I'm going to get that repetition because I found the selectivity. I selected something that I liked, and I'm going to keep doing that thing over and over and over again, like refining or perfecting the experience that I'm having. And then that's another reason what I was saying too about, I don't really like experiencing new restaurants all the time, because the risk that I'm going to walk into a place that I don't like is high. The space, the lighting really matters to me. The sound, how loud it is, really matters to me. The service that's there, like just the vibe in general, like all of that stuff is just such a big deal to me, that when I find that one thing, I'm gonna keep going to that one thing over and over and over again. I am not going to go out and try to experience something new. And that's where a slight difference is what my interpretation is of markets in general, of what they talk about with markets is more external markets, versus this internal markets is this like perfection of repetition thing. So also the other thing too, and this one's just a little bit more obvious because it's talked about, is internal markets you feel energized by the correct space. External markets, you feel relaxed by the correct space. So there's like that bit of difference. And then also that's where observed and observer comes into play. So as an internal markets, when I'm in my correct space, which I'll be in my correct space over and over and over again because I've refined and found like the perfect space, like what's good for me, that going back to it all the time, I'm going to feel in my element. I'm going to feel really comfortable there. And that's like when I'm going to be observed because I'm vibing, right? Like I'm like feeling it. And I've also noticed this too in places that I've lived. So I have thrived in like living in certain areas. So I thrived living in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Really loved living there. It was good for me at that moment in time of my life. And I felt like I was like, you know, vibing. Things were good. I like had a whole setup, I had a routine, I had repetition, like I was being given all these things, like there were great restaurants to go to and great places to like meet up with friends. And it was like, that to me is the perfect example of a person with internal markets, where it's like I found my comfort zone and I perfected it, I loved it, and I was like vibing in it. So you know, I had that like feeling of feeling energized and lit up. So I was really like, even business wise, like doing like thriving, because I was being energized by my environment. It was the perfect space for me to be. Versus right now, I currently live in Montreal, and I noticed that, you know, I have my repetition, I have the things that I consistently do, I've got my apartment and the space and orientation, all that type of stuff, but it just doesn't vibe the same way that I did when I was in Dartmouth. It's a big, like it's actually a very noticeable difference for me, where I'm not in my element here, I'm not in my zone, I don't feel like, it's not the same vibe at all for me. So that would then mean is I may be in a city, but it's not the correct environment for me, really. So yeah, I hope that gives you an example. I don't want to go like too like more into this without me feeling like I'm rambling, but yeah, the way your arrow faces matters big time. So if you don't necessarily agree with or can resonate with what's being said to you about anything in your chart, this particular circumstance, your environment, it's probably just because it hasn't been explained to you properly in the detail that it needs to be explained to you according to what specifically is going on in your chart. So I hope that helps a little bit more, kind of bring some understanding to things. And yeah, talk to you guys later.